city of Ashton had always been a quiet, ordinary town. Nestled between towering forests and rolling hills, it was the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. People went about their days, oblivious to the strange happenings that, over time, would begin to disturb the calm veneer of daily life. It started with whispers, just hushed conversations in coffee shops, murmured during the slow mornings when the sky was still overcast and the streets, slick with dew, reflected the dim glow of the streetlights. There were stories of a man without a face, a figure who had been appearing at random spots in the crowd, vanishing just as quickly as he emerged. The tales were vague, like shadows at the edge of your vision. Some described him as tall, others as unnaturally thin, and there were even reports of his presence being accompanied by a coldness in the air, an uncomfortable stillness that made the hairs on the back of one's neck stand at attention. No one seemed to know where he came from or what he wanted. They only knew that he was there, in the crowd, among them, moving in and out of the streets, like a ghost. His most notable feature was his lack of a face. People would catch brief glimpses of him, but the more they tried to focus, the more his features would blur, disappearing into a smooth, unsettling emptiness. It was as though their minds refused to process the sight, blurring the image or perhaps hiding it so that it would not be remembered. At first, people laughed it off. They said it was just an illusion, a trick of the light, or maybe just a figment of overactive imaginations. But as more and more people started to claim they had seen him too, the rumors grew. Some even swore they had crossed paths with him in the bustling streets, only to look back and find he had vanished. They would search, but there would be no trace of him, not even a shadow left behind. He was always gone before anyone could take a second, longer look. But even in a city like Ashton, where most people were too caught up in their daily routines to notice such peculiarities, it was impossible to ignore for long. The story spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of even the most rational of minds. They began to wonder if the man was real, or if he was something else entirely. Some whispered he was a lost soul, forever condemned to wander, invisible to all but a few. Others speculated he might be some kind of supernatural entity, an omen of something worse to come. As the days passed, a creeping sense of unease settled over Ashton. It wasn't just the rumors. People began to notice things, strange little details that they couldn't quite explain. The air felt colder than usual, and the streets seemed emptier at night, as if people were avoiding something they couldn't quite see. Cars would slow at certain intersections, the drivers glancing nervously, eyes darting about as if they feared a presence they could not define. But it was one man, just one, who would become the focal point of this strange phenomenon. His name was Lucas Fairchild. He was an ordinary man, or at least he had been, until this thing, this faceless figure, began to haunt him. Lucas was a writer, someone who spent his days in the quiet solitude of his small apartment, the type of person who had never particularly enjoyed the hustle and bustle of city life. He preferred the calm, the quiet, the hidden corners of Ashton, where he could work uninterrupted. But ever since the rumors about the faceless man had begun to swirl through the town, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It started innocently enough. He had been walking down Main Street one chilly evening, heading home after a long day at the local library, when he saw him. At first, it wasn't anything remarkable, just a brief glance of someone moving through the crowd. his form melting into the sea of pedestrians as they all moved in rhythm. Lucas hadn't thought much of it. People passed by him every day. He didn't even know most of their faces. It was the way of things in the city. But then the next day, Lucas saw him again, and then again the day after that. At first, Lucas dismissed it as a coincidence. After all, Ashton was a small town. You couldn't help but run into people, even the most peculiar ones, if you frequented the same places. But the more he noticed the faceless man, the more the feeling in the pit of his stomach grew. It wasn't just that he saw him. It was the way he seemed to be, watching. Every time Lucas went into a store, there he was, standing just at the edge of his vision, lurking at the back of the crowd. His presence was always fleeting, always just out of reach. Whenever Lucas turned to look directly, the man would disappear, as if vanishing into thin air. But there was something about the way he moved, too fluid, too smooth, as if he was part of the environment itself, indistinguishable from the world around him. What unsettled Lucas the most was how he couldn't help but notice him. It was as if his eyes were being drawn to the man without his permission, as though his mind was forcing him to acknowledge something that shouldn't have been there. He tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was just his imagination running wild. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was something deeply wrong about it all. The unease was building, and he couldn't escape it. Every time Lucas walked through the crowded streets, he felt the chill of a cold breath on his neck. He felt eyes on him, though no one was ever close enough to be staring. The man was always just out of sight, just beyond the reach of his awareness. And it wasn't just happening in the streets. The presence followed him into quieter places, into the small cafes he frequented, the parks he would sit in to clear his mind. Each time he would glimpse the faceless figure at the edges of his awareness, only to turn around and find that nothing was there. Soon, it wasn't just a feeling that something was off. It was a certainty. The man wasn't a figment of Lucas's imagination. He was real. And more terrifyingly, it seemed that every time Lucas tried to distance himself from the figure, the more frequent his sightings became. He couldn't escape it. Every corner he turned, every shadow he crossed, the man was there. At first, it was manageable, a flicker in his peripheral vision, a brief moment of discomfort. But as the days turned into weeks, the encounters grew more intense. Lucas began to feel the presence of the faceless man, even when he wasn't physically near him. He would feel his gaze, the cold, empty gaze, settling upon him from a distance. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it. The days were becoming harder to bear. Lucas found himself more tired, more anxious, more aware of the creeping sensation that something was wrong with his world. The faceless man was no longer a mere presence in the background. He was intruding on Lucas's life, pressing into the cracks of his consciousness. And yet, every time Lucas tried to confront it, every time he tried to find the truth of the man's identity, he was always left with nothing. No face, no form, no answers. It was only when the encounters became more personal that Lucas began to understand that the figure wasn't simply a fleeting image. It was following him, learning him, adjusting to his movements. Something darker, something more terrifying was taking shape in the empty spaces between them. And in the midst of it all, Lucas found himself asking a question he could barely answer. Was he the only one who saw this faceless man? Was there something wrong with him? But the question that chilled him the most, what if the man wasn't just watching him? What if, in some unfathomable way, he was becoming a part of Lucas? As the days blurred together, Lucas found it harder to ignore the growing unease that had settled deep within him. The strange sensation, the feeling of being watched, had become a constant, gnawing presence in his life. It wasn't just when he was out in the streets anymore. Even in the comfort of his own apartment, the unsettling thought that the faceless man was close by, lurking just out of sight, never left him. He'd stare into the corners of his room, convinced that if he looked long enough, he would see him, standing silently in the shadows, watching, waiting. The first time it happened, when he truly began to realize how close the figure was to him, was on a night when the wind howled outside, rattling the windows of his apartment. Lucas had been sitting at his desk, staring at the blank page of his typewriter, his mind struggling to find words for his next project. The hum of the city was distant, muffled by the thick walls of his building. It was a quiet evening, or at least it seemed to be. But then, as he glanced up from his desk, he saw him there. It wasn't like before, where he had only caught fleeting glimpses of the faceless man in the corners of his eye. No, this time Lucas saw him clearly, standing at the end of his hallway, just outside his bedroom door. He was tall and thin, his silhouette almost blending into the shadows. The space between them felt impossibly vast, yet Lucas could sense the figure as if he were standing right next to him. The lack of a face was the most chilling part. It wasn't just that the man's face was missing. It was as if there had never been a face to begin with. Lucas' heart pounded, and his breath caught in his throat. His pulse hammered in his ears, louder than the wind that swept through the trees outside. The air in the room felt colder, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end as the oppressive silence seemed to stretch around him. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again, the figure was gone. Shivers ran down Lucas's spine as he scanned the room. There was no one there, no sign that the man had ever been in his apartment. But the feeling, the presence, lingered. It was as though the figure was still there, still waiting for him to look away again. Lucas didn't sleep that night. He stayed up, staring at the shadows in the corners of his room, his hands clenched into fists by his sides. Every creak of the old floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside, made his pulse race. But he never saw the man again that night. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Or perhaps, Lucas thought, he never truly had been there at all. But deep down, Lucas knew the truth. The man was real. He had seen him. And the worst part was, he had no idea why. The next few days became a blur of anxiety and dread. Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that the faceless figure was watching him, following him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. He couldn't even walk down the street without feeling his presence in the crowd. He would look over his shoulder and catch glimpses of the man's silhouette, slipping between the shadows, vanishing whenever Lucas tried to get a closer look. It was as if the figure was becoming more persistent, more invasive. No matter how fast Lucas walked, no matter how many turns he made, the man was always there, just out of reach. And the more Lucas saw him, the more he felt a strange compulsion to keep looking. Every time he caught a fleeting glimpse of the faceless man, he felt drawn to him, as though he couldn't resist the pull. It was an urge he couldn't explain, a need to understand what was happening, even though deep down, he was terrified of what he might find. One evening as Lucas sat at a small cafe near the edge of town, trying to distract himself with a cup of coffee and the hum of conversation around him, The man appeared again. This time, he wasn't in the crowd. He was sitting at a table across the room, his silhouette just barely visible through the bustle of patrons. Lucas' breath hitched. His heart began to race as he watched the man. No, the thing, sitting there unmoving, staring straight ahead with that blank, featureless face. For a moment, Lucas froze. He couldn't tear his eyes away. There was something about the way the faceless figure sat so still, so silent, that made everything else in the room feel insignificant. The chatter of the other customers, the clink of silverware, all faded into the background as Lucas's gaze locked onto the figure's presence. It was as if the world had narrowed, and all that mattered now was the faceless man. Suddenly the man stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and in that instant, Lucas felt a surge of panic. Without thinking, he pushed back his chair, stumbling to his feet and heading for the door. He couldn't stay in that cafe any longer. He couldn't let the man, whatever he was, get closer. But as Lucas stepped outside into the cold evening air, he found himself standing in the middle of the street, alone. He looked over his shoulder, his pulse hammering in his chest, expecting to see the man behind him. But there was nothing. The street was empty. The silence was suffocating. With trembling hands, Lucas pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the number of his friend, Sarah. He had to talk to someone. He couldn't handle this alone anymore. His mind was unraveling, and he needed answers. But as the phone rang, his eyes moved to the reflection in the glass of the cafe's door. And there, in the reflection, he saw him again, the faceless man standing just behind him. Lucas gasped, spinning around. But there was no one there. He looked back at the glass. No reflection. The man had been right there, in the reflection, standing just behind him, where he couldn't see him with his own eyes. His stomach turned. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body felt paralyzed. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where every corner you turned only brought you closer to the thing that was hunting you. With his heart racing, Lucas stumbled away from the cafe, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the presence that seemed to follow him no matter where he went. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the faceless man was there, just out of sight, always just a step behind him. That night, when Lucas finally returned to his apartment, he collapsed into his bed, utterly exhausted. But sleep would not come. The weight of his thoughts was too heavy, too consuming. The man, the faceless man, had followed him here, into the solitude of his own home. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't live like this, constantly hunted by a figure who existed only in the shadows, always out of reach, but never far enough to feel safe. The days began to blur into one another. Lucas' mind started to slip, and with it, his sense of reality. He saw the man everywhere. In the mirror, at the grocery store, across the street. The faceless figure had become an omnipresent part of his life, always just a glimpse away, always watching. It was as if the world around him was slowly warping into something unfamiliar, something distorted by the faceless presence. One evening, after a particularly long day, Lucas stood before his bathroom mirror, his eyes bleary and tired. He hadn't slept properly in days, and his reflection seemed to warp and flicker under his gaze. As he stared at his own image, he saw the faceless man in the reflection, standing behind him. It was as if the figure had crossed into the mirror itself. But something was different this time. Lucas stepped closer to the mirror, his breath catching in his throat. The reflection of the faceless man was clearer now, more defined. His shape was distinct, his presence undeniable. And then Lucas realized something that made his heart stop. The reflection he was looking at wasn't his own. There was no face, just a smooth, empty skin where his features should have been. He raised his hand to his face, fingers trembling as they brushed against his skin. But there was nothing there. His face, his own face, was gone. Panic surged through Lucas's veins, sending a chill racing down his spine as he stumbled back from the mirror. The truth crashed over him like a wave. His reflection, the faceless man, and the growing void where his identity had once resided. He felt as though the very essence of who he was had been stripped away, leaving behind a hollow shell. The world around him spun, and he gripped the edge of the sink to steady himself, fighting against the tide of panic threatening to consume him whole. What was happening? How could this be real? Desperation clawed at him, and he turned back to the mirror, forcing himself to confront the horror reflected there. His heart raced as he reached out once more, fingers trembling as they traced the outline of his own face, the smooth, unmarked skin where his features had vanished. The emptiness stared back at him, an abyss filled with uncertainty and dread. He closed his eyes, taking a shaky breath. He had to remain calm. He had to understand what was happening. Perhaps this was a nightmare, a cruel trick of the mind, a manifestation of his growing fear and anxiety. He forced himself to open his eyes again, hoping to see his familiar features. But the empty visage remained, a grim reminder of the faceless man who had haunted him for weeks. With a deep, shuddering breath, Lucas tore himself away from the mirror and stumbled into the living room. The shadows loomed around him, dark and suffocating, whispering secrets he could not comprehend. He felt like a stranger in his own home, lost and afraid. He moved toward the window, desperate to find some clarity, some connection to the outside world. But the streets of Ashton were cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from flickering street lamps, casting long shadows on the pavement below. The haunting presence was still there, lurking just out of sight, and Lucas could feel it pulling at him, tugging him toward the unknown. He hesitated for a moment, torn between staying in the safety of his home and confronting the terrifying reality of his situation. But deep down, he knew he couldn't hide anymore. He had to face the faceless man, had to confront whatever darkness had seeped into his life and stolen his identity. With newfound resolve, Lucas grabbed his jacket and slipped out the door, determination coursing through his veins. The cool night air hit him like a slap, invigorating yet terrifying. He walked briskly down the street, the echoes of his footsteps lost in the stillness of the night. He felt as if he were walking into the depths of his own mind, where shadows danced and twisted, leading him further into the unknown. As he reached the edge of the town, the fog rolled in thick and heavy, wrapping around him like a shroud. Lucas hesitated for a moment, peering into the darkness that enveloped the familiar streets. But then, the chilling feeling of being watched washed over him, and he pressed forward, determined to find the man who had haunted him for so long. The world felt warped, like stepping into a twisted dream. Shadows stretched and distorted around him, morphing into shapes that danced just beyond the edges of his vision. Lucas moved deeper into the fog, the sense of dread rising within him. He was drawn to a small park at the center of town, a place he had often visited for inspiration, but now felt like a sanctuary twisted by fear. As he stepped onto the path, the fog began to swirl and coalesce, and there, just ahead, stood the faceless man. He was shrouded in shadows, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around him. The figure stood still, as if waiting for Lucas to approach, and in that moment, the air grew heavy with an unspoken tension. Lucas felt an electric surge of fear and determination. This was it, the moment he had been dreading yet anticipating. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, as if he were stepping into a realm beyond reality. The faceless man remained motionless, an eerie stillness enveloping them both, and Lucas felt the weight of his own existence pressing down on him. "Why are you doing this?" he thought, desperation lacing his mind. "What do you want from me?" But the faceless man offered no answers, no comfort. Instead, Lucas felt a surge of anger welling within him, a fierce determination that pushed him closer. "You can't take me. I won't let you." As if sensing his defiance, the faceless man began to move, gliding forward with an unnatural grace. Lucas stood his ground, heart pounding, as the figure approached. The world around him began to warp again, colors bleeding into one another as reality twisted and shifted. It was as if the very fabric of existence was unraveling, threatening to consume him. But instead of fleeing, Lucas felt a strange connection to the figure. In that moment, he realized that the faceless man was not just a harbinger of fear. He was a reflection of all Lucas had been trying to escape, the shadows of doubt, the insecurities that had plagued him throughout his life. The man was an embodiment of his fears, the manifestation of everything he had allowed to consume him. Suddenly, the faceless man reached out, extending a hand toward Lucas. It was a gesture that felt both inviting and terrifying, and Lucas hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. He could feel the chill radiating from the figure, yet there was something oddly comforting about it, as if the emptiness was inviting him to confront the darkness within himself. With the trembling hands, Lucas reached out and grasped the faceless man's hand. In that instant, the world around them exploded into a kaleidoscope of colors, sensations, and emotions. Memories flooded back, moments of joy, sorrow, pain, and triumph, all intertwined in a beautiful tapestry that showcased his life. The faceless man began to dissolve, his form melting into the vibrant colors surrounding them, until all that was left was a swirl of emotions that coursed through Lucas's veins. In that surreal moment, Lucas felt the weight of his fears lift. The faceless man was no longer a figure of dread. He had transformed into something deeper, an integral part of Lucas's identity. He was a reminder of the struggles he had faced and the resilience that had carried him through. The emptiness that had once terrified him was now filled with a sense of clarity and purpose. As the colors swirled around him, Lucas felt himself being pulled into a warm embrace of understanding. The darkness that had lingered in his mind began to dissipate, and for the first time, he could see himself clearly. His features reappeared, more vivid and defined than before. He was no longer just a shadow. He was a whole, complex person, shaped by his experiences, both good and bad. The vibrant colors around him began to settle, transforming into the familiar sights and sounds of Ashton. Lucas opened his eyes and found himself standing in the park, the night air still cool but no longer oppressive. The faceless man was gone, yet Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. He was free. With a newfound sense of purpose, Lucas turned and walked back toward the heart of the city. The streets, once cloaked in darkness and shadows, now glimmered with the promise of possibility. He could hear laughter and music wafting through the air, a reminder that life was vibrant and full of moments waiting to be embraced. As he strolled through the familiar streets, Lucas felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The people he passed no longer seemed like faceless strangers. They were individuals, each with their own stories, their own struggles. He saw the world with fresh eyes, a renewed appreciation for the beauty that surrounded him. Finally, he reached his apartment, and as he stepped inside, he glanced at the mirror once more. He stood before it, and this time, what he saw reflected back was not just a face, but a life filled with potential and hope. The emptiness that had once threatened to consume him was now a part of his journey, a reminder that even in darkness, there could be light. Lucas smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He had faced his fears, confronted the faceless man who had haunted him, and emerged stronger than before. In embracing the darkness within, he had found the light, and as he began to write again, the words flowed like never before, each one a testament to his journey, a journey of self-discovery, resilience, and the beauty of being truly alive. As he typed away, the soft glow of the lamp illuminated the pages, and the shadows danced playfully around the room. No longer a source of fear, but a canvas for his creativity. Lucas knew that the faceless man would always be a part of him, a reminder that within the depths of despair, there lies the potential for transformation and rebirth. And so, with each keystroke, Lucas Fairchild reclaimed his story, one of bravery, vulnerability, and the undeniable power of the human spirit. The tale of the faceless man became a chapter in his life, a turning point that led him toward a brighter future, filled with endless possibilities and the promise of new beginnings.